Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski, managing editor at the Cipher Brief. Welcome to the latest in our conversations about goings-on in the world. We're close to home today, talking about the country of Venezuela, where we are awaiting the inauguration again of President Nicolás Maduro to lead that country. Joining us is Cipher Brief expert and former ambassador to Venezuela, Patrick Duddy. And Ambassador Duddy, perhaps we can just start with setting the table for those who might not have been following laser closely. How have we got to this moment in Caracas?
Well, Hugo Chavez was originally elected back in 1998.
Right.
He died in 2013. He was succeeded by his then vice president and foreign minister, Nicolás Maduro. Maduro has since stage managed several electoral processes, and the most recent was last summer on July 28th. That election has been widely denounced by the United Nations, by most of the democratic countries of the world, as fraudulent. And the democratic opposition in Venezuela was able to prove it by producing and posting the voting records, called the actas, from more than 80% of all the voting stations in the country. And that material suggested that the opposition candidate, Edmund Gonzalez, had won about 2/3 of the vote. The Maduro team refused to recognize that outcome, and eventually, effectively, drove Edmund Gonzalez into exile. He left in a sense voluntarily, but only because he was almost certainly about to be detained. And then the non-elected, but widely acclaimed leader of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, went into hiding. This Friday, the Maduro regime is scheduled to choreograph an inauguration,
Right.
Yet another inauguration for Nicolás Maduro. Nicolás Maduro really retains virtually no democratic legitimacy, has become a real pariah, both in much of the world, but also very specifically in Latin America. Edmund Gonzalez, whom the United States recognizes as the president-elect of Venezuela, has vowed to return this week. And Maduro, for his part, has said that if he does, he will be arrested.
So can we talk a little bit, picking up right there, Ambassador Duddy? We know also that the Biden administration in its last month received Gonzalez, the opposition figure, very recently. And so he's going to go to Caracas. Are we headed for not just a political, but is this likely, given the things that the Maduro regime has said about his return, likely to be a violent showdown, or what do we think we need to be prepared for here?
There's been a certain level of violence at several points in recent years, and I think it's too early to say how violent this week will get. And that will, to some degree, depend, I suppose, on Maduro's reaction to Gonzalez's return. And it may also be affected by who is accompanying the president-elect when he returns, because there are some rumors that he will be accompanied by one or more former presidents from the region. I don't know that is true, but I have been given to understand that Mr. Gonzalez has met with a number of ex-presidents in Panama and elsewhere.
So that would be kind of a cordon of officials.
Oh, perhaps.
Yeah.
The Maduro regime is sensitive to, they're prepared to largely ignore, but they are sensitive to how things look to others in the region. And they are also aware that much of the region, including many other leaders who define themselves as being as Maduro does, as of the left, have refused to recognize the legitimacy of his claims to have been reelected. So it's not clear yet what's going to happen. A certain level of violence probably can't be ruled out, but we haven't seen kind of wholesale, near civil war-like conditions in Venezuela that have occurred in some other countries.
Right. And beyond the obvious interest that the United States has had in promoting democratic elections in the region, what else, just remind us, as a former ambassador, other United States interests at play here? Should unrest unfold and so forth, why does Venezuela matter?
On the economic front, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
Now, their oil sector is, in fact, dysfunctional. Right? It's dilapidated and has long suffered from a lack of adequate capital investment, and that sector requires substantial capital investment. But beyond that, Venezuela has actively courted Iran, Russia, and others in an effort to forge a united front to limit and roll back any influence that the United States has within the region. And they've become a source of support to some of the other very repressive governments, which we see in Latin America, the Cubans and the Nicaraguans coming most immediately to mind.
Right. So last question, Ambassador Duddy, what can the United States do about any of this? What do you think the United States should be doing about what's going on?
Hard question. Do I think we should invade? No. Theoretically, the elections that took place last year happened after an agreement that was, to some degree, choreographed. There was an agreement between the opposition and the regime, but it happened under, to some degree, a chapeau of U.S. support for the democratic process. And the regime made very specific commitments from which they almost immediately began to walk away, and from which they walked away definitively by later in the spring. As a consequence of the initial agreement, the U.S. lifted some sanctions. As the regime walked away, we reimposed them, but we did not reimpose them all. And there are still measures that the U.S. could take which would be punitive for the Venezuelan regime. And I think we should be ready to reimpose those measures if things get out of hand. At the same time, I think we should be continuing to work with the United Nations, other countries within the region, the Organization of American States, et cetera, to do what we can to foster a return to democracy and protection of human rights.
I can't resist a question that as a diplomat you're probably not going to want to answer, which is, if you had to handicap, does Maduro finish this term, what would you say? Not going to go there?
Well, I would only to say that the regime there has survived longer than many people thought likely.
Mm-hmm.
And to some degree, that's it. That is possible if A, you don't care about world opinion, and B, you have the resources necessary to sustain yourself in power.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the oil and gas sector in Venezuela is dilapidated, but it still it generates just enough income to support the regime.
Right. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Patrick Duddy, former ambassador to Venezuela and Cipher Brief expert, talking about the inauguration of Nicolás Maduro returning to the presidency. Thank you again. Appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure.